Okay, let's switch gears very quickly if we can. I get messages on my computer. I call it the wormhole as we go along. Joe writes, Art, can you have him go into detail on the entity case? I heard the interview you did with him back in the 90s, and boy, was that a spooky case. Do you remember which one that was, Doctor?
Well, of course. It began August 22nd, 1974, Culver City, California. It began when my old colleague at the time, was in a bookstore in Westwood, Hunter's Books, and he's talking about our work with a friend. And a woman and her friend on the next aisle overheard him, and she said, "Oh, by the way, my house is haunted." So my colleague went, "Okay, give me your name and number. We'll call you and set up an appointment." Mm-hmm. So we did, went out to her house maybe a week or so later. It was a hot August night, and Neil Diamond wasn't there.
There you go.
And very muggy in the house, little shack on Braddock Drive in Culver City. And the first thing, Doris Bither, B-I-T-H-E-R, the very first thing she told us right off the bat, that she'd been repeatedly raped by a ghost. And we went, "What? Huh?" We rolled our eyes back, and we thought, this woman is, emotionally disturbed. She needs help. She needs psychiatric intervention, medication, therapy, but she doesn't need parapsychologists. Right. So we took notes down, but they said, "Well, there's nothing we can do for your situation." She went, "What?" I said, "We suspect what you need is something far different than us." And that was it. And then a week later, I wrote a big P on the top of the form, fill out in every case. That, to me, was the person psychotic. There's no reason to waste any more time with them. But she called back about a week to 10 days later, and some friends and neighbors had witnessed things. Well, this changed the whole thing, because if there's corroborative testimony and multiple witnesses, you suddenly take some interest. So we go back to a little house on Braddock Drive. We're standing in the kitchen talking, and the lower cupboard door comes open, and a iron skillet jumps out, or frying pan jumped out, and takes a leap of a few feet away from the cupboard. And we checked for if there were animals in there, or wires, or springs, or who knows what. There was nothing. And there began the onslaught. And the bedroom suddenly was ice cold. It felt like it was refrigerated, yet it was a very warm summer. And yet we couldn't detect the source of the cold. And we couldn't always record it, which is even stranger.
That's what I was going to ask. Could you measure it?
Not all the time. We also, the temperature drop was also correlated with a disgusting odor of decomposing organic matter, like a body rotting. Right. And, we smelled it, we didn't. We smelled it, we didn't. We brought in a Hewlett-Packard sniffer, and it couldn't pick up anything. And then we began seeing these strange pops of light, and what's this? And so we saw them. We then tried to control Doris's environment. We put up poster boards over her walls and ceiling and over the windows. This was happening primarily in her main bedroom.
Can I ask you, when you say pops, I actually have a couple of questions. When you say pops of light, what do you mean?
Just like a light popped on real quickly. It popped on and popped off, popped on. But the lights began to move. I called them corpuscular masses, because they looked like gelatinous in nature. And they were clearly three-dimensional, very dynamic, and flying around the room. And they were always lime green in color. Do not ask me why, because I have no idea.
Okay, I won't, but what I will ask is, take you back, one other question, then you can go on, and that is, you said you encountered witnesses to corroborate this woman's story before you really got into it. What did they see, and how many witnesses?
1, 2, 3. There were 3 witnesses, all women. Okay. All a little older than Doris. Right. And seemingly a little more grounded. She was very cryptic in her answers to her questions and somewhat evasive. Today, if people are that evasive and cryptic, we walk away. We just leave because we know we're wasting our time. So the witnesses, independently of each other, described these strange lights that would show up and move around her house. Okay. And they'd hear noises, and they'd smell things, and, see things out of the corner of their eye, and it began to disturb them. Now, Doris had 4 children, each by a different man, 3 boys and a girl. We never met her girl, who was very young. She kept her out of the house, so we were there, which is a very good decision. But we met her boys, and typical, from young teenager to an older teenager, and all they wanted to do was watch TV and play music. Mm-hmm. So we began observing things which was consistent with what the other witnesses had described, and we got a photograph. The problem was we saw a ball of light. This is on my website, several different blogs. One's called the Paradoxical Entity Photographs, and also the Real Entity Case. You'll see both the images on both. It looks like a comet with a tail on it. And we don't know what this was. We shot it at very high. We used Tri-X film pushed in development, and we got the strange light. But we never saw something like that. And then at one point, lights started swimming. They were flying around Doris in her little bedroom. And we did get some pictures of those, but they weren't lights. They were arcs of light, and this is also depicted on my website and in my book, Chapter 2.
Doctor, how frequently was this woman being sexually assaulted by this entity?
Well, those began and ended long before we knew her.
Okay.
So we couldn't prove or disprove that she'd been raped because so much time had passed.
Right.
But, her story took on more credibility by the fact that we began having experiences there that we could somewhat document, with cameras. But what we got in these two frames were extraordinary because Doris is sitting on her little bed in the bedroom, and there's an arc of light that frames her, goes from down, the bed goes up over her and back down. And what makes this particular shot so intriguing, Art, is that the walls behind the arc of light meet at a 90-degree angle. So if this was the projected light source, the light would be bent in accordance with the wall. Yet it is not, which tells us the light was in free space.
Really? Yes, really around her.
So that is pretty amazing. And then another point, in that one of the many times we were there, these lights coalesced in the corner of the bedroom, and they formed an apparition of a very large man from about the waist up. You could see the head, the brow ridge, the jaw, the outer orbits of the eyes. You could see the upper torso, the musculature, the pectorals, the biceps, the whole bit. And then it cut off at the waist, and it was that same sickening lime green. And this image wasn't a static one. It was articulating, meaning it was moving.
Oh, boy.
And then it popped like a light bulb, like someone turned a light bulb off, and it was gone. So I told everyone, don't say a word. When you stop shaking, sit down, and here's pens or pencils, write down what you saw.
Good idea.
And we all saw the same thing, with almost no variation. So we were shooting dozens of photographs of the apparition, whatever it appeared to be. And they didn't show anything. There was no glowing apparition of a large male standing there. There was nothing. Wait a minute. We all saw the same thing. How did we see them all if there was nothing emitting light that we could observe? A little bit of a problem. Michael Persinger's work, we know for a fact that very low-level electromagnetic fields could induce very intense audiovisual hallucinations in people. And it's an established fact. If that were the case in this instance, with up to 25 people in that little bedroom, you would expect a great deal of variation from one to the next.
You bet.
There's no such thing as a shared or hysterical hallucination. There's mass hysteria, but not mass hallucinations. And unless you're subject to a hallucinogen, and even then it isn't the same. So if we all saw the same thing, what was causing that image to appear to our eyes? Or did it appear to our eyes? Or maybe we saw it in our mind?
Well, if something is literally injected into your brain so that your optic nerves register it, it's not necessarily going to be recorded on a camera.
Correct. If something is affecting your brain directly,
right?
Let's say the occipital lobe or the frontal lobe,
yes,
or parietal or whatever, and that affects your brain to have some sort of visual hallucination. You can't record that with any instrument I'm aware of on Earth that we know of. Although the Russians decades ago were claiming they could record things like that, and it never proved out. The question is, what did we see? Well, the case evolved. It evolved. The phenomena grew weaker over time. But at one point, we're in the bedroom. It was ice cold, and we were basically holding a little seances with nothing else to do. And we put on music that the children or boys said when they put it on, whatever, at certain points of certain songs, the phenomena would increase. So we started doing that, and we saw that it did indeed increase. But was that due to our intense dislike of the music? Or was that due to the fact that there was some, correlation with the audio, the acoustic waves coming off the record players, and we'll never know. But at one point, the black poster board started tearing off the wall. Now, each black poster board had a number and a magnetic orientation. So if we got more photographs, we could tell where they were coming from and going to. We had a reference grid. And suddenly something, after we're pleading, do something. Suddenly the duct tape was being pulled off right in front of us, and it flew off the ceiling and hit Doris in the head.
Wow.
Which is pretty good, given that there are 25 people in the room.
All right, so this sounds like poltergeist activity.
Exactly. And contrary to what the book made you to believe, now Frank D. Valitta did a great job of turning the case into a novel, and the interpretation of the novel and the book was that it was a ghost. However, the evidence does not support that hypothesis, in my opinion. It supports the hypothesis this was the poltergeist case. This is discussed in Chapter 2 of my book in depth. Now, when Doris moved, finally, from Culver City to Carson, it followed her. We had some experiences there, but at a lower level of activity, discussed in my book and on my website. She moved again to Texas. It followed her there. And by the time we saw her again in '83, when the movie The Entity came out, she claimed it had all but ceased. However, a good friend of mine named Javier Ortega from GhostTheory.com, he's been able to speak to her 3 male children, and they claim that phenomena began before she lived on Braddock Drive in Culver City and continued long after they moved. And the problem is, the one who did the most speaking of it kept contradicting himself during the interview, which is not a good indication of either memory or honesty. And, now Doris Beither passed away in 1999 at the age of 58. And the cause of death was cardiopulmonary arrest, but they don't know why her heart and lungs stopped. They just decided to.
Yes, many deaths are unexplained. A lot of people don't know that, but many deaths go virtually unexplained. Was there any indication, Doctor, of what began the attachment of this poltergeist to her?
Well, according to what her kids said. When they were living in Santa Monica before they moved to Braddock Drive, little things began happening, banging noises, things that appear and disappear. They'd see lights, but it was a very low level. They move into the Braddock Drive house sometime later, and it's a little shack. It was condemned several times by the city. I'm surprised anyone could live in it. So she moved in. A few days later, an elderly Hispanic woman comes up to the door, knocks on it. Doris goes to the door. What do you want? And she says, this house is evil. You must leave it. It used to be a farmhouse. You can't stay here. And Doris went, are you out of your mind? What are you talking about? The lady left, and Doris forgot about it. And then sometime, not a short time later, things started to peak in Doris's new home. Now, as I said, most of my case file, I'd say 98% of my cases are linked to people, which seems to be the norm. However, it's more complicated than that, because we've now learned that this phenomena is the result of some people's neurophysiology interacting in a very extraordinary way with the electromagnetic environment or geomagnetic environment they happen to live in. And if they have the right type of neurophysiological problem, this may end up producing what we call poltergeist activity. And this is outlined in my book ad nauseum. But bottom line, as poltergeist activity is referred to as recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis, meaning it's not controllable. It can be a macroscopic level where heavy, massive objects can move, including people. And this case supports that.
Doctor, is it your view, in looking back on this case now, that she was the center of the activity, voluntarily or involuntarily, more likely, she was producing this poltergeist activity herself?
Yes. And my book discusses this in depth in Chapter 2, that there were libidinal fantasies that were somehow being externalized, and they were triggering the onset of these phenomena. Doris had a really very dysfunctional relationship with her family growing up, with different men, and it's sort of like there was an episode of Star Trek, I forgot the name, it was with Michael Dunn. They were on a planet where all the elders had psychokinetic abilities. And at one point, one of the actors becomes sick, one of the people, and Spock said, we're seeing this telekinetic or psychokinetic manifestation of Parlam's delirium. And And that's sort of what we think was going on in Doris's case. And this makes it all the more interesting, because if something can affect us, the environment, and we couple with it in a very unusual way, we can release energy that can tear the environment apart like that. At one point, the fuse box was torn out of the wall, thrown at Doris. Candelabra was thrown at her. It's more amazing that it was coming from her than if it was a ghost. And
that's astounding. I mean, just to sit and observe these things happening, to see them happening, I say on the one hand, I would love to be able to observe and see it myself, but it would scare the you-know-what out of me. So I don't know if I really want to see it.
If you live to be 1,000, you have higher probability of being hit with a meteorite in 10 minutes than you do of this phenomena harming you. It's just, your own fear is usually the biggest problem anyone has. Our own fear is, because we're startled, we don't know what it is. It didn't threaten us, but it certainly did terrible things to Doris, at least, by what we did experience there and record over time in her initial home and then in another home, and then she moved from Carson to San Bernardino, Riverside, and then to Texas, and just continued to happen.
All right. Hold tight, Doctor. We'll be right back to you. This is the shorter break. Lots of content in this program called Midnight in the Desert. I'm Art Bell.